talking about first chapters and a little bit about prologues. Mainly just because I think prologues deserve their own lesson, so we're mainly going to be talking about first chapters, but some of these apply to prologues. Alright, now we already had a lesson on this before, so probably, well, we had an adult writers club lesson, but I taught it here, so go check back the writing compelling first sentences lesson, because of the fact that the main thing that you're going to be worried about in your chapter and your prologue is your first sentence. Now, I know that a lot of people say, oh, well, as long as you catch their attention in the first paragraph, that's fine. Technically, that is true. Technically, as long as it's somewhere within the first paragraph, you're okay. But I will say the more attention you can grab in the first sentence, the better. Because most people have a very short attention span. So the quicker you can get their attention, the more likely you will keep said attention. And as I said before, try to make it emotional or action-based from the very beginning. Try to make it something where the character is confronting something new, whether it be something entirely new because they've been dropped into a fantasy universe, or whether it's something semi-new because they're moving to a new house. It doesn't necessarily have to be drastic, it just has to be emotional enough that we can relate to the character and feel that there's something going on, feel that there's some sort of tension. There needs to be an emotional or action-based tension to keep us wanting to read and keep our attention gripped. And this goes with the prologue too, because, and even if you have a prologue, first sentence is still important in the first chapter. Why? Because 50% of people, and this is no specific statistic, but it's just been my experience, about half of my friends skip the prologue and the other half read the prologue. And the same for when I go into English classes or things like that. The English teacher will be like, so in the prologue, and they're like, oh, we were supposed to read that? So don't guarantee that they're going to read the prologue. Make sure that your first chapter sentence is just as compelling as your first prologue sentence. They need to be equally compelling, so that way if they skip the prologue, like they shouldn't, then you'll be okay either way.
Yes, Theodore did something really interesting of he did the prologue as, or like as a he did the prologue as like the beginning of the story. Kind of like if where everything happened, that is the reason why the book exists, the story.
Oh, gotcha.
Exists.
See, I like that too. That whole idea of being like the whole reason this is happening. Prologues can be very compelling. I definitely agree with that. You just need to make sure that you show the reader why it is compelling, why it is worth reading, and if they skip it, ultimately that's their fault. But you still want to make sure your first sentence of your novel is compelling too, just so that way if they don't read that beautiful prologue, then you're okay.
It was a very intense, and so I was reading the prologue. I'm like, what did I get myself into?
Yeah, and that's what you want your readers to be thinking. You're like, holy cow, what did I get myself into? But also, like, I don't want to stop.
Well, like the prologue was like kind of violent. But
yeah, that can be good too, though. Like I said, action or emotional based. Having violence in your prologue or your first chapter, or even in and especially in your first sentence, doesn't have to be a bad thing. It does depend on your genre, though. If you're doing like junior fiction, maybe not. But if you're doing a dark dystopian YA, having action in your first sentence is definitely not a bad thing. I'd actually encourage it. Just a smidgen. You don't have to go crazy. Like, no, you don't have to go bloody, gory, whatever, but as long as it's got a little bit of action, a little spicy something, it keeps the tension going, not just this vanilla kind of. I mean, I don't know, everyone likes their vanilla, but generally you like your vanilla and you like some variety, right? So, spice things up with some action or some emotional tension in your first sentence. Alright. And then, of course, we have to have some don'ts as well as some do's. And I know we've mentioned this before, but this is important. Don't info dump in your prologue or your first chapter. Prologue, it tends to be quote-unquote more acceptable. I actually would disagree with that, even though it is like more acceptable in general, I still think that if you want people to skip your prologue, info dump. Because even people who really love prologues and insist upon reading prologues will stop reading or skim over it if there's info dumping. You gotta make sure that you show, don't tell. And if you are going to tell, you've got to tell it in a very compelling way. Like, instead of, there are dragons, everything sucks because the dragons rule the world. You gotta do it in a little bit more compelling way. Have either some sort of narrator or something that makes it unique, like a kid saying, you know, it was really terrible when my whole village burned. You know, that's far more compelling than just saying there are dragons and they suck. You gotta make sure that there's something worth continuing for, and info dumping just feels like a textbook, and it's not good to feel like a textbook. Your readers don't want to read a textbook. They want to escape from reality, regardless of whether it is fantasy or realistic fiction. You can introduce your world later. That is the most important part. I think a lot of people assume that they have to world build all up front. You have to just go world build, just huge amounts of world building all up front. And yes, you do want to make sure that you don't have white room syndrome, but there is such a thing as too much world building in the beginning. You need to make sure there's this fine balance between world building and info dumping. If you just like say, oh, the grass is blue and it's a windy day, like that's good world building. But if you say, the grass is blue because of the ancient bones of dragons buried here, and those ancient dragons fought in a war in 1680, and it's like, okay, too much information. You can reveal that later and it'll actually be far cooler, because we'll be wondering this whole time, like, oh, why is the grass blue? And then later, when you reveal, oh yeah, it's because of the bones of dead dragons, it's like, well, that's awesome. But it feels far more awesome if you're not just dumping it all on the reader and you're just sliding it in naturally. If you're just letting it happen, or you show it, for instance. If instead of info dumping, maybe have them find a dragon skull buried in the ground and kind of smile and say, I wonder what happened to all the dragons. Well, at least they give us this beautiful blue grass, because from their bones comes this blue pigment in the grass, or something like that. That would help the reader to visualize it more instead of just completely and utterly being overwhelmed by it. But I would still say be careful of, even if you don't info dump, world build slowly. You don't want to overwhelm your reader. Alright, the next point that I'm going to mention is make sure that there is conflict, both internal and external, in a first chapter. Why? Because it's really kind of boring to just read about Sally woke up, Sally brushed her hair, Sally went to flute practice. It's like, okay, I'm bored. But if you say Sally's super nervous because of the fact that if she doesn't get into this flute practice, then she will lose her chance to be part of this Magic Wizards Academy that uses specifically music as their thing. It's like, oh, okay. But yeah, it's like, wow, that's far more compelling, right, than just she went to flute practice. Yay. You gotta make sure that you feel the character, you feel their emotions, so you can relate to them. And especially this helps in preventing feeling like it's a Mary Sue or a Marty Stu character where they're super overpowered, because of the fact that conflict tends to generate feelings of empathy and sympathy for the character, and that helps make us attached to them rather than just thinking, oh, well, Sally's perfect. We can really resonate with them. And on top of that, having external and internal action can help too to grow and facilitate the story as it goes along. The more conflict that you have in the first chapter, the more your readers are going to get excited. Now, again, there's a big, huge caveat on this. Don't be careful of info dumping. You need to introduce the external and the internal conflict, but introduce it slowly. Don't just immediately be like, the whole world is burning! I mean, that could be exciting, but then you gotta be like, whoa, back up, breathe a second. Okay. You gotta let the reader adjust. If you're gonna do the whole world is burning in the first sentence, you gotta make sure that there's some way that we can figure out what the reader's internal, the main character's internal conflict is as well. Because having a external conflict is all fine and dandy. But you gotta make sure they have an internal conflict too. We all have internal conflicts, regardless of how exciting our lives are, right? There are lots of people who their life seems fine and dandy, right? And you're like, oh, I wish I could be them. And then you learn that their life is not so fine, and it kind of sucks. And so it's important to have that internal and that external conflict. For example, the external conflict could be that they are moving houses. So that is going to be a conflict, whether it's positive or negative. They could be super excited about the move. But then there could be an internal conflict where they're really sad about leaving their friends, even though they're excited about the move because they'll be closer to, I don't know, Broadway or something, and that's their dream, is to become a Broadway star. So they have this conflict of, oh, hey, this move is really positive because I'm going closer to my dream, but also I'm really sad because I'm leaving my friends. That helps make it so that we can really resonate with the character as a reader and to want to keep reading rather than just, it's a book. Sally played the flute. Yay. Need to make sure there's conflict there. All right. Next thing. Okay, I'm just going to put this up here and then I'm going to explain. Don't do the hello and goodbye character. Where, in other words, don't start with a character we will never, ever, ever see again. Don't be like, this is Joe Bob, and Joe Bob's very compelling as a character, and then the whole rest of the book is about Jimmy. And you're like, why was Joe Bob even there? And he never makes another appearance. Ever.
It almost Brandon Sanderson started
Yep.
all of his books with
Well, he just starts them all with Boyd.
yeah, Boyd.
But see, in general, like, that's at least consistent, right? You gotta have some sort of consistency if you're gonna do this character that they never see again. You gotta keep it consistent. Like, for example, if the character you never see again starts in the first chapter and then ends in the last chapter, you can kind of be like, oh, they're kind of like the narrator, right? Or if they always start every book with this, then, oh, okay, we're familiar with this person. But if you just jump right in and then it's like, bye, Joe Bob, never saw you again, and then Jimmy takes over forever. It's like, why did we even bother? Might as well have deleted that first chapter. So, don't do the hello and goodbye beginning where you're like, introduce this character just so they can explain the world and then immediately back out. Pick a character that you want to stick with, or that if you're going to do the head hopping thing, make sure that they arrive fairly swiftly. So if you introduce a character that we are going to see again, but it feels like we're never going to see them again because it's going to be a while, maybe hint at them being there or foreshadow them being there, so that way the reader doesn't get frustrated or confused and they're like, oh, okay, they're getting there. You know, they haven't gotten there yet, but they're getting there. Let them take their time to write it out. You gotta give them something to nibble on their way there. It's kind of like the appetizer, right? You gotta make sure that they're kind of eating before you just are like, here's dessert. And it's like, I know some people like starting with dessert, but most people are confused. Most people, it's like, thanks for dessert, but also I'm still hungry.
I just like, yeah, dessert's good, but where's the real
Hey,
food?
thanks for the dessert, but I want to actually like enjoy your food, so give me the food you cooked.
Exactly, like, please feed me?
And I'm just like, oh yeah, we cooked the ice cream.
Yep, clearly, we cooked ice cream. But yeah, so you gotta make sure that when you're doing this, treat it like you would a meal at a restaurant. You have the appetizer, then you have the meal, then you have the dessert. You gotta make sure you're trailing them along. So if they don't see the character, if they see like a tiny bit of the character in the beginning and then they don't see them again until the end, make sure you trail them along throughout. You drag them along through it so that way they're still not confused and they have this promise of, you will get there, just not right this second. All right, next one. Too many. Don't start with too many characters. And how many is too many?
56,000.
I would say how many is too many? Oh boy, I would say it depends on what you're writing. If you're writing a short story, any more than 3 is too many, because of the fact that that is not enough time to get to know each and every character. Sure, you could do like maybe 4, maybe even 5, but that's pushing it. Once you get into the 5, 6, 7, 8 zone, delete some characters, combine some characters, simplify it. However, if you're doing a novel, you can do more characters, but make sure that each character gets their due diligence and that you don't introduce them all in the very first chapter, because that will get very confusing very quick. If you introduce maybe 2 of them in the first chapter, and then introduce another 2 of them 4 or 5 chapters later, and then another 2 of them 4 or 5 chapters later, then it feels more gradual and you can get used to all the characters. For example, with Percy Jackson, right? We start with Grover and Percy. Super simple. And then we slowly move to Chiron, right? And then we move even a little more to Annabeth. And then you just keep going, gradually adding these layers of characters. It's kind of like, layer is a good way to put it. It's kind of like a cake. If you're making a layered cake, you want to make sure there's a layer and then frosting and then a layer and then frosting, right? The frosting is those chapters in the middle that help make it so they're separated and they don't get confused. If you just put a bunch of layers of cake on top of each other, you might as well have just kept all the cake together. Might as well have just thrown it all in a bowl and baked it all at the same time. And if you're trying to get a rainbow cake, that's a very awful scenario, right? You throw all the colors in the bowl at the same time, you're going to get a very brown cake. Hopefully it's chocolate flavored. So generally, if you're looking for a rainbow cake, you're going to need a red layer frosting, an orange layer frosting, a yellow layer frosting. You know, you got to make sure there's those layers in between to make all the layers stand out. And it's the same thing with characters. So the problem with too many characters, it just means don't introduce them all at once in the first chapter. If you're going to have 7 characters, only introduce maybe 2, possibly 3 in the first chapter. And don't introduce another 2 or 3 until at least 4 to 5 chapters later. Give a gap. For every 2 to 3 characters you introduce, give another 4 to 5 chapters to let them get used to it.
I said regular series.
Yeah. So in general, most authors follow this, and if they don't, you'll notice it because you will be confused. I've read a couple books like that, and I'm like, oh, I really wish the editor would have just told them to like spread this out, because holy cow, I don't remember who Joe is. I just remember that he is one of the people. Like, it should, yes, people feel like it should be obvious, but even if they have very distinct personalities, people can only adjust to so much at one time, right? It's kind of like when someone rattles off a phone number to you, right? If they say 801, so on and so on, so on and so on and so on. You know, like, then it feels a lot better, right? And you're, like, able to write it down as you go. However, if they're just like, you got it, right? You're like, no, I didn't.
Okay, repeat that again, but like slower.
Way slower, yeah. So it's the same idea with characters. Just take it slow, introduce them slowly.
Yeah.
All right.
Vita when telling people her phone number.
Wait, when telling her?
Yeah, telling people her phone number.
Vito's a girl?
Yes, Vita is a girl.
Oh, I thought you said Vito.
No, Vita.
Anywho, all right. Gotta love the character confusion. All right, so next thing that we're going to talk about is don't/do. And this is don't/do because we're going to talk about how to do it and how not to do it. The wake up day, aka the normal average day, or I woke up and I'm going to go brush my hair and take a shower thing.
I'm going to go for hair. Oh wait, my hairbrush is like disintegrating.
See, there you go. That makes it far more interesting, and that's why I say do/don't. If you're going to have them wake up and go to the mirror and their hairbrush is disintegrating and they look in the mirror and they see themselves like fading away into blackness, boy, maybe you want to start there. Like,
Thanos
holy
all
crap.
over again.
I am so interested. But on the other hand, don't do just an ordinary day. Do not start on the day when it's just like, okay, I wake up, I brush my teeth, I go to school, go to math class is all right. Like, everyone has those days. We're reading this because we want to be more interested. And even if it's realistic fiction, and that means that they are going to have some of these, make them interesting. Make it so that when they wake up, they get a text from their ex, and they're like, oh my gosh, he's the worst. And we're like, what happened there? You know, make it so there's compelling drama instead of just, yes, today is perfect, and I have the best hair and the best day.
That's
It's like,
me.
no one wants to read that. In general, we like being able to feel like there's something new that the character is experiencing in the first chapter. So, like I said, if you're going to do a wake-up scene, do make it unique. Absolutely. You can do the wake-up scene. You can do the average ordinary day, just so long as you very quickly establish why it's not normal. And by very quickly, I usually mean within the first page.
And
Or
just, like,
even sooner.
It's like, yawn. I woke up, or like, I'm gonna be saying wrong. I woke up and then I looked in the bathroom. My hairbrush was disintegrating.
Exactly. That is like even a first sentence, like, boom, you're establishing that conflict. I can't snap today. There we go. You're establishing that conflict. You're making sure that you have this drive to read the rest of the story and figure out what the heck is happening, right? Whereas if you started it just normal and then 10 pages later they're like, oh, by the way, my hairbrush disintegrated this morning, it's like, wait, what? Why didn't you mention that earlier? So make sure, if you're going to do the wake-up scene, just make sure you establish drama and conflict right up front. That way, in the first couple paragraphs, like I said, probably even the first paragraph, but you could stretch it, I guess, and do second or third paragraph. Make sure that you make it compelling, you make it interesting. You catch the reader's attention and make them realize why this day is not normal.
Yeah, no, this day is not normal because
Alright.
because there's a dragon in my backyard instead of a cat.
Now, this is important because a lot of people tend to just do one or the other. I know we just already talked about conflict, but I felt like it was worth going over again because of the fact that there is a lot to be said for external versus internal. Now, a lot of you will notice that certain genres tend to do certain things. For example, mystery tends to go over here in external. Romance tends to go over here in internal. High school drama, or just drama in general, tends to go over here in internal. External, action novel, and so on and so forth, right? You generally have one or the other, but you gotta make sure you have both. Every good mystery also has internal drama. Every good drama also has external drama. You gotta make sure that it ties both in somehow, and that the internal actually plays an important role. It can't just be something like, oh no, I'm in love with two men, what do I do now? You know, the classic love triangle, it's like, okay, the classic love triangle can't be the only thing that's going on. Maybe that character is like, oh shoot, I think I might be polyamorous, but I'm in a relationship or something like that. That would be compelling. Or if you have this internal conflict of, hey, I think I might be from another planet, or I think I might be adopted or something. And if it's a romance novel and it's something, you know, you have that internal conflict. However, you gotta make sure that you also have an external conflict. So even in a romance novel, you gotta have something external. Whether it's, I think I'm being haunted by a ghost, or I think that this guy is trying to hunt me. This is where the subgenre comes in.
It's just like, oh, I think my ex is trying to murder me.
Right. It's like, okay, so you have the internal drama that establishes in romances and dramas, but you also got to make sure the external drama makes itself known, and vice versa. In a good mystery novel, you don't want it to just be, there's a dead body, and I'm the best detective ever. What if there's a dead body, and man, I feel like as a detective, I am really failing my family, and I don't know what to do, because all I ever do is work, and I just feel stuck, you know, something like
or
that.
You're just like the worst detective ever, but you're the only one in town.
Yes, or you're the worst detective ever, but you're the only one, therefore you have to solve this, and everyone's like, the pressure's on you, kid, and you're like, thanks. Exactly.
And that true thought, I was like, your dog, because
See?
your dog was hungry and you didn't give him like dog for like 3 weeks.
But see, you gotta have external and internal conflict that matter. They gotta be important. You can't just have the classic, like I said, oh no, whatever shall I do? I failed a math test, and it's like, yes, that sucks. We've all failed a math test. But is it because if you don't get this exact certain score, then you can't go to college with your boyfriend? Oh, that's a bigger problem, you know? Whereas if you just fail a math test, it's kind of like, we haven't established that internal conflict yet. We've established the external, the failed math test, but we haven't established the internal.
Unless you've like failed a math test and you're a straight A student and like, oh crap.
Yes.
Extra credit. What can I do?
There you go. See, that establishes the external of being a straight A student with an F, and the internal of, oh shoot, I'm a perfectionist, I have to have that A.
It's just like
That's me. Like, no joke, that is me.
And that's okay.
And then if you
We're
don't-
all very different and diverse people, and that is the beauty of life. Where, like I said, we can have a love triangle where it's like, normally it's like, oh no, which one will I choose? And then it's like, what if I just choose both? You know, like,
just like what if
Or
I
just
killed
like,
one?
person A has been with me forever. Person B was a jerk, but he's hot.
That's like that can happen too in stories. See, every story is so diverse and every story is so different. You don't have to tell the exact same story as everyone else. And everyone's gonna face their own dragons and their own demons, and they're gonna be bigger and they're gonna be larger than life to everyone else. So for example, like we talked about with the math test, that might not mean anything to a kid who is already failing math and just wants to be an artist when he grows up and doesn't give a flying flapjack about freaking anything else. I'm just saying in general, I'm just throwing out random scenarios here, the first thing that pops into my head. But that might not mean anything to them. Or it might be that, hey, I cannot get into this very specific college for this art degree if I fail that math test. Those are two very different scenarios, but they're still both very valid ways of portraying an artist, right?
Yeah.
And both of those dragons are equally terrifying, right? The idea that, oh shoot, I'm not going to get to go to college because I don't have these good grades, so I just got to make it on my talent alone, is just as terrifying as, oh shoot, I can't get my grades up, and if I don't, I can't go to this college that I want to go to. Both are terrifying, and you got to make sure that you establish the fact that externally and internally, these are valid fears for your character, and explain why they're valid and why they want them so badly. All right.
Just like, oh, we have to go to that school or else my friends are gonna kill me.
Well, that's a bigger problem.
Yeah,
All
no.
right.
And then
You have
fail it.
homicidal parents.
Oh, boy.
That's fancy. Someone came to mind for homicidal parents, and now I feel bad.
Gotta love when
But-
you're just like, I
oh, well.
created the worst character ever, but I'm sorry, not sorry.
Well, it's like someone I know.
Oh, gotcha.
Wait, who?
Oh, boy.
I'm not
Anywho,
telling you.
so, the next point of first chapters I'm going to talk about is don't reveal too much. And this is going to go with the next one too, however. Do reveal just enough. Now, here's the tricky thing. What is just enough versus too much? Now, too much is generally what gets you info dumping. This is where you say, oh crap, I'm panicking because blah 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 lists off whole life story. This is why everyone laughs at the
This
old
is
villain
not
cartoons. This is why everyone laughs at the old villain cartoons where it's like, I'm going to give you my giant monologue while you have the time to now escape. And it's like,
Villains
boy.
in kids shows
Mhm.
monologue so much, and I'm like, yeah, I respect a good monologue, but
Oh, yeah.
shut up.
there's a difference between monologue and
And-
freaking just will not shut up.
It's like-
Someone got to quote Incredible.
Yes.
I'm not doing it.
Yeah, that's honestly why I feel like this is important. So do reveal just enough. Like you said, we all love a good villain monologue where it's like, why are you doing this? And it's like, well, obvious. And then it's like they give this little paragraph of information, right? Maybe a minute, 2 minutes tops of a monologue. Don't reveal too much. Have them going on for, 8 minutes about their evil plot and how they were raised secretly by gnomes.
And they're like,
it's like,
just like,
okay.
literally going for 8 weeks about like.
Yes, it's just talking and talking, and in the meanwhile, Sherlock Holmes is just like casually undoing his handcuffs.
Like
just,
even Dr. Doofenshmirtz. Like
Yes,
by the
it's
end of
short.
by the end of the series, we know his entire life story and
Oh,
how
yeah.
messed up
but
his
it's
childhood
over
was.
the series, right?
It's
And
over
there's
the entire
tiny
thing.
little things
And even just like the backstory of the day, it's
Yeah.
so good.
Doofenshmirtz is actually a really well done villain because of the fact that we relate to him emotionally because he reveals just enough to make us relate to him emotionally, but not so much that we're overwhelmed. If he had told his whole life story in that first episode, we'd be like, like, just this is awful. But because he did it bit by bit, it felt like just enough to keep us going and compel us. And that's the same thing with first chapters. You gotta make sure that you reveal just enough to get us emotionally attached to the character and want to move forward with this character and say, you know what? I like this character. Let's keep going. Let's just power right through this, you know? But on the other hand, you don't want to try so hard to make them relatable that it's actually damaging. Where you're like, oh my gosh, look, these are all the ways in which they relate. Then your reader's gonna sense that you're basically trying to shove empathy on them, and people don't feel empathy when you're trying to shove everything on them. However, if you're telling them in a very honest and genuine way, like what has happened to you over the last little while and how it's hurt you or how you're being affected by it, that is absolutely perfect. But if you're just absolutely and utterly being like, and for the last 3 months I've been thinking about, it's like, oh boy. Let's just sit down, pull out, Instagram.
This is what therapists are.
This is fair. This is what
If you're
therapists are.
thinking about something for 3 months, chances are you need to let it out.
you need some help. But yeah, with
Or
that,
stuffed animals.
and with that, I will say, if you're gonna do the reveal too much thing, you gotta make sure there's a reason for it. So, for example, you could do the history book thing. Where you say, hey, this is and if you do the history book thing, you gotta be careful not to go textbooky. You gotta make sure it's interesting. It's like, I am this historian, and I am writing this because I think that I may die due to the curse on this island. And then you're like, ooh, I want to read because I'm curious if you die. That's interesting. But if it's just like, 7 years ago, there was a dragon who attacked a village, and I slayed him because I'm awesome. We don't want to read
I
that.
don't care if you're awesome.
We don't want to read that.
It's like, alright, let's see if I can kill you. Plot of the book.
Exactly. It's like, oh boy, I'm bored.
Still hurt anyone?
Heck yeah.
So, in general, if you're going to reveal too much, you got to make sure that you do it in a way that makes sense. Or, like you said, that could be an alternatively interesting first chapter where it's them talking to their therapist. And so, as a result, they're doing a lot of info dumping. But because of the therapist interjecting and trying to, coax them along, it feels more natural because that's what would naturally happen rather than just dumping on the reader because you feel like it. You got to have a reason for your info dumps.
I have this one character who had a really sad childhood, and he hasn't told anyone about it.
Vito?
But
Hayden.
Caden, obviously. Anyway, shut up. And so he hasn't told anyone but the person who grew up with him. And then finally, when he goes insane because of magic, he lets it all out. They're like, dude, are you okay? And he's like, no, I'm insane, idiots.
It's when I shout.
Sorry.
Anywho,
Get the lyrics right.
Alright, so in the first chapter, you're gonna want to do things to avoid this. It was actually funny, my husband pointed this out in one of the things that I wrote recently, but we call it white time syndrome because he couldn't tell what time anything was happening. Despite the fact that I had flashbacks, it was not obvious they were flashbacks, and so he was totally confused. So, white room / white time syndrome. White time syndrome, as I'm going to call it, is when the first chapter is jumping around so much between past and present and future that your poor reader is going, when did that happen? Wait, I thought they were alive. Now they're dead? Did they just die? Or did and then you
Once
keep
upon
reading and
a
they're
time,
like,
be
it's
like-
alive again, and it's like,
It's like, what are the sentences?
yeah, you gotta make sure that you don't have white time syndrome. You gotta make sure they know when it's taking place and why. And by when, I don't mean you have to say exactly 2019 at 2:14 a.m. unless you're doing a very specific mystery novel.
Yeah, unless you're a spy and you have every timestamp
Right.
burned in your head.
Right. In that case, that's okay. But generally, when we're writing, we don't want exact time. We just want to know if it's past, present, or future. Simple.
Yeah, was
But
this
make sure it's
one,
clear.
There was this one episode of Once Upon a Time, if y'all have ever seen it.
I have seen it, so I'm curious which one.
And it was like jumping from like present day and back and present day and back, and we're like, stick with one timeline, you blasted criminal, I hate you. It was great.
Wasn't the episodes go back
I gotta
and
say,
But,
with going back and forth, that can be a really compelling story writing method. However, you gotta make sure it's absolutely clear which is which.
Yeah, and
It's
it
perfectly
wasn't.
clear. It's gotta be crystal clear, or else you're gonna obviously annoy your viewer/reader.
Yeah, no, wait.
This is the same thing with White Room Syndrome in
They
writing.
have a kid, and then they don't. Where did the kid go? Oh, it's in the path, you friggin' animal.
Yes.
Okay,
Fine.
so if you like do like if you like doing like middle of a page like an italicized flashback, would that be like telling, and would that be like not very
Make sure all past things are italicized or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I do.
I think that absolutely could be a good way of establishing it, but I would still say make sure that you make it obvious, especially if it's a flashback. Because if they are having a memory moment and then you just suddenly switch to italics, they may catch on, they may not catch on. Some readers, you gotta spell it out. So it also depends on which age group you're going towards, and even in general, just people. You might think it's perfectly obvious to you, but maybe have a couple people read it and give them no context and then ask them, so did you know that the italics are past? And if they say yes, great. If they say no, you have a problem.
Yeah, I also have all of my flashbacks written in third person, because usually in the viewpoint of someone who's dead.
Yeah.
Great.
Wait, what, Vito?
And so, no, not Vito, for the last time.
You
Said
said you
you
couldn't
guys
love
liked
though.
Vito. Okay,
I'm
anyway.
gonna stab you.
Alright, fine.
Don't stab anyone, please.
Anywho, fine, I'll stab you at home.
Alright, so next is White Room Syndrome. So with that, this is more of a writing thing than it is a show screen thing, because of the fact that with screenwriting / shows, it's pretty obvious where we are, right? And if we switch settings, we're gonna obviously know we switch settings. However,
Yeah.
unfortunately with writing, you gotta make it known. Elsewise,
Yeah.
if you just say, hey, I'm gonna walk into the living room, but you don't tell the reader that, then they're like, why is there a lamp in your kitchen? They're gonna be confused.
Yeah, just like, wait.
It's like, you were just making dinner, now you're sitting on a couch.
Yep.
You have a couch in your kitchen, just like, oh
Nice
yeah.
kitchen, my friend.
It's like,
Exactly. It's like,
I just like, I'm gonna beat some eggs, but like, I'm gonna watch some, like, I'm gonna watch some Endgame while I'm doing it.
you gotta make sure it's consistent and clear and obvious. That way, and especially if you're introducing us to a fantasy world, you don't want to.
yeah.
You don't want to just be like, and you jumped into another realm, and then all of a sudden they're like, and the sky is red, and you're like, I was imagining it blue.
The sky is red. Wait.
You gotta make sure it's not so jarring for the reader. And then
Yeah,
of course,
it
same thing, but I'm calling it different because white person syndrome just sounds awful. So I'm calling it blob person syndrome.
Character blobs.
Character
Yeah,
blobs.
white
Where you have no idea what they look like because you're just like, and so you kind of create an image like, and then later it's like, oh, and they're going on their first
Megan.
date. And you're like, I was imagining him as 9. Help. It's like this is a
Megan.
very bad picture.
Megan be like,
Didn't we,
like talk about this already?
We have talked about some of these already, but these are all first chapter things. That
There
are
are a
all
lot of repeats, get used to it.
Okay.
Mainly because of the fact that there are things that are just important that I think a lot of people, it takes A, multiple times to learn, and B, not everyone has heard of these.
Yeah. And when
So-
you repeat stuff, people remember it more and that their writing's better. Just why not repeat it? Because it's not hurting anyone.
Fair enough.
It's
But
hurting my
anywho.
It's not hurting your brain. You
Immediately
hurt my
dies
brain.
of brain.
Okay. My nose still hurts.
All right,
I'm wearing,
so-
like, socks.
But
Rip.
make sure that you got it, that your characters are fully developed by the end of that first paragraph. I would say at least, Maybe even if you really want to stretch it by the end of the page, but sometimes by then the reader has already formulated an idea, so try to make sure it's in the first paragraph.
Megan
All right.
like, oh yeah, second book in the
my
middle of it. Oh yeah, she has blonde hair.
Yeah, by the way, her hair is blonde. Just so you know, I felt like that would be a good thing to know. I'm like, yeah, I would have in the first chapter. We're fine. I'm not salty now.
All right. With first chapters, you got to make sure that there's something interesting and new happening. And by interesting and new, I mean unique to your story. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, and all of a sudden in 1979 they built the first time machine, and you're trying to write a historical novel. Like, no, you don't have to change history if you're writing a historical novel. You just got to make sure it's an interesting and new way of you telling it. For example, a great way to do this is fairy tale retellings, right? You don't necessarily have to say, oh, yes, and I'm going to have Cinderella, go and fly off on a dragon. Like, that could be awesome, but it's interesting and new because it's interesting and new to you. Make sure that you aren't just retelling the same old story. That's the main thing about first chapters. If you're telling a retelling of Cinderella, we don't want to hear, and she was an adorable girl, and her father died tragically, and now she has a terrible stepmother and 2 terrible stepsisters. Like, we've heard
And
this
they all
Cinderella
died
tale
in a
1,000
volcano.
times.
I was gonna say, I'm like, I recognize this.
Yes, we've all heard the Cinderella tale 1,000 times. Make sure you make it interesting and new. If you're gonna do something,
Like a scene
in general, make sure it's interesting and new. Whether it's someone moving, everyone has a different experience with moving, right? In general, even if you've never moved before, that's a different experience with moving, never moving. So you all have a different experience and a different viewpoint on things, and so do your characters. Make sure it's an interesting and new viewpoint. What makes your character original? What makes your character unique? Is your character, going to school, but there's secretly a cat in a person costume? That's
it's
interesting.
like the opposite of a furry.
That's interesting.
That-
You're like going, what is
Oh.
happening? Like, that is interesting and new though, right? It isn't just going, oh yeah, and it's the same old Cinderella story, but because I wrote it, it's cool. It's like,
Just because you know doesn't mean it's cool. If Brandon
Unfortunately.
Sanderson wrote Cinderella but didn't put any twists on it,
No twists.
I'm sorry.
I'd be sad.
But if Brandon Sanderson retold Cinderella, that'd be sick.
Right, but if Brandon Sanderson retold Cinderella as like a freaking Mistborn novella,
Oh,
like,
heck yeah.
that would be awesome, right? Like, this would
Yes.
be so cool. So you gotta make sure in that first chapter you establish why it is interesting and why your story is unique and new.
Wait.
And even if it's just a
We have
story
the
that's
best
similar
idea.
to another
Okay,
story.
this
For
is
example,
insane.
you've all heard the classic high school drama, she really wants to get the boy, but it's so hard to get the boy type of thing.
Popular
she
girls
dies.
can screw it.
We've always heard that, right? We've heard it 1,000 times. However, what makes your version unique? Is it
Twist,
because
she dies.
Twist, she dies. Or twist, she's a shapeshifter, and so she secretly is the girl that he likes, but she's afraid he won't like her as her actual self because she's been shapeshifted this whole time.
Been from this one, anyone?
So it's like, you gotta make sure that this whole idea is, whatever you're establishing in your first chapter, there are a lot of repeats. Yeah, we have a lot of plots that are the same. Damsel in distress. Cinderella.
I will show
There's
you Damsel
so
in Distress.
many things that we retell, but that doesn't mean you can't retell it in a new way. Is it damsel in distress, but now instead it's prince in distress? The poor prince is like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know how to run a kingdom, and now I've been kidnapped. Help! Like, make a new twist on it. Or it is
The
the
one
princess.
girl in the kingdom that knows how to fight. Pathetic.
Yes, or make it an even more interesting damsel in distress where it's like, I kidnap you because clearly that will be how I take over the kingdom, and then it's like, JK, the princess, is a werewolf. Now you have to try and control that.
Well, it's like, never mind, she's annoying as frick.
It's like,
You know what?
never
Yeah,
mind,
no,
not a
I'm
damsel
trying
in
to
distress,
please you
damsel
like
is
that.
the
Yeah.
worst. So you gotta make sure that you show what's interesting. You show what's new about your telling, because irregardless of whether it's similar to an old one where it's, the classic love triangle, or whether it's the classic, heroes beat all, you gotta make sure that you show what makes yours so cool. What
I'm
makes
actually
yours so
thinking of
unique?
killing off like 3 of my characters.
Oh,
Wait,
geez.
are you gonna come visit?
No.
All right.
Wait, so there's Keaton, Marcella.
Okay.
Killing off Marcella,
And
maybe.
then the most important part
Vito.
that I actually think that we don't talk about often enough
And maybe Aspen.
is just relax.
Or Night.
I know that this is a lot of stuff, and I know that I talk about a lot of stuff, and as it was pointed out today, I sometimes repeat myself because there are a lot of generalized rules about writing that are important to know. And to be honest, I even Googled, like, what are the most important things for first chapter writers to know, and most of these were stuff that popped up based on what they said, that I was like, oh, I've already talked about that, but I guess it's what everyone thinks you need to know. So, yeah, there are going to be a lot of repeats, and there are going to be a lot of rules, and it's going to sound pretty intense. However, ultimately just relax. If you are not having fun writing it, your readers will not have fun reading it. This is why we have editors. Editors are to help you take your fun and fantastic writing that you enjoyed writing and then turn it into something a little bit more readable and less confusing. As long as you're having fun, that's what's important. And yes,
Yeah.
writing can be work sometimes, especially if you're a professional author, because you have to put an X amount of time per day writing. Yes, absolutely. You have to treat it like a job. But that doesn't mean you can't have fun while doing it.
Yeah, you should giggle maniacally when your characters turn insane.
Exactly. You should enjoy your job. And you should enjoy writing, ultimately. You gotta make sure you relax and you enjoy it. Because if you enjoy writing it, your readers will enjoy reading it far more. Do any of you guys have questions or concerns about first chapter? Like, you can mention, hey, I did X in my first chapter, what do you think? Or, what do you think about doing X in first chapter? Like, I would love to hear your thoughts about what you guys think is important or something I didn't mention as far as first chapters go.
So I have this little snippet of like the characters' lives in my like technically my first chapter, but it's also like
Right.
prologue-ish. It's something. And then I like switch it over to 2 characters, but I do technically introduce them all in like one chapter. But
What do you introduce me as?
I would say,
yes, I do.
how long is the chapter and how many characters do you have?
So I have 6 characters, and it's 3 little snippets because there are 2 characters a snippet. And the chapter like isn't terribly long, but
I would say probably make it longer then, just because if you don't give at least, I would say 3 pages minimum, 4 pages preferable to each set of characters, if you're doing it in little snippets, then it's really easy to get lost. The only reason I
Sure.
say this is because of the fact that I actually had a friend once who she was writing a short story, and I was deathly afraid of telling her, you have 8 characters, and I have no idea who half of them are, because she tried to introduce them gradually throughout the short story. But unfortunately, her short story was only 8 pages long. That meant that for
Oh.
8 characters, you had
That's-
about a page per character.
that's rough, honey.
So you've got to make sure that for every 2 characters you introduce, you have a minimum of 3 pages, possibly 4, before you jump to the next 2.
Alrighty.
That's just my personal recommendation. I haven't read it, but that is my personal recommendation. That way it gives us long enough to get to know them before we jump, so we don't feel quite so jarred as a reader.
That makes sense, yeah.
Okay, cool. Any other questions about characters,
I think you
first chapters mainly, or prologues? Because even though this was a first chapter lesson, I did mention prologues cursorily because a lot of these apply to prologues.
I need to like redo the entire start of my book. That'll be exciting.
I wouldn't say you'd have to necessarily redo it. You can always just flush out parts.
Fair.
I would say, especially with flushing out parts, generally, generally with fewer characters, generally with that many characters, you probably added less detail than you needed. I could read it if you'd like and look over it, but generally, I would say people who write shorter amounts with more amounts of characters tend to need more detail than they think, and that's just normal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's super normal. Like I said, my friend did it, and she was a senior in high school when this happened. So, like, it happens to every writer. At some point, you're just like, I want to tell you all the things, and it's like, please breathe.
Yeah.
So you're not the only one.
My classmates ask what my book is about, and I give them like a rundown of all of my characters, and then I start going into plot and like, yo, I just asked for the genre. And I'm like, oh, it's a spy fantasy. And they're like, okay, cool.
Right. It's authors. We want to just dump all this info on our readers, and the poor readers are just like, help!
What the world's going on? I thought we were in Kansas.
So yeah, you gotta make sure that if you're doing a lot of characters or there's a lot going on in your first chapter, that you just slow down a little bit, and don't be afraid to slow down. I know that a lot of people are like, I gotta make sure I keep the pace up. I gotta make sure this is interesting. I gotta make sure this is, and yes, you do. You don't want to make sure that you're describing every single time she brushes her hair. But at
That's
the same
boring.
time,
And
exactly, that's
important.
boring. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're not just going, and then he hit the person, and then he ran off, and then he galloped away on the horse, and then he, whoa.
Slow
Slow down.
Hold your horses. Don't have
Literally.
horses.
Everyone in
Hold
there was
everything
like,
you have.
slow down, buddy.
Exactly. You gotta make sure that there's a difference between being too slow and too fast. And it's okay if you need to slow down. As writers, I notice most people have a tendency to go way too fast. And as a result, we need to remember it's okay to slow down. We like action, we like intensity, yes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if it's all action and all intensity, you're gonna burn out real quick. And so is your
Yeah.
reader. So you just gotta make sure, just take your time. Alright,
Slow
seems
parts
like
are
we're good.
It makes the faster
It
part
is.
seem faster.
Exactly, it makes the faster parts seem faster if you have slower parts. If you don't have that contrast, then how are you supposed to feel that? Absolutely, well said. Okay, any other questions, or are we good?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment.
Okay,
Save it.
I'm probably just gonna turn off the recording then first. Okay, thank you.